Welcome to the Golda Meir Speaker Series at Metropolitan State University of Denver. My name is Andy Thangasamy, and I'm an instructor of political science at MSU Denver. And today we're joined by Dr. Tom Birkland. And Dr. Birkland is an internationally recognized expert in the politics of disasters and crises. He has examined a range of such events, including oil spills, nuclear power accidents, earthquakes, and the like. His books include After Disaster, Agenda Setting, Public Policy, and Focusing Events, Lessons of Disaster, Policy Change After Catastrophic Events, and also a textbook on the public policy process, which I have used as an instructor here at MSU Denver. He's also the author of numerous scholarly articles on crises. His research has been funded by the National Science Foundation. He's currently a professor at North Carolina State University in Raleigh, North Carolina, and has previously taught at the State University of New York at Albany. We are very, very fortunate and very happy to have Dr. Tom Birkland here with us. Welcome, Dr. Birkland. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah. We have some questions. I have some questions organized for you, so let's get to them. In terms of thinking about the COVID-19 crisis, where we are currently, and thinking about it as a focusing event in public policy language or parlance, how do you expect this to influence or affect public policy priorities at national and at state levels in the coming years?
Well, we're already starting to see it. It's going to have major influences, major effects. We're seeing, for example, massive funding, for relief bills in Congress. Less reticence on the part of Congress to spend money, to borrow money. The deficit's going to increase. The national debt's going to increase. But we're borrowing now, in a sense, to at really low interest rates, frankly, to try to prop the economy up to the extent we can, and to lessen the blow, the economic blow. So there's economic policy implications, but there's also going to be health policy implications. We're going to ask a lot of questions after this about, were we prepared for this kind of a pandemic? Well, we knew this was coming someday. Most experts knew that at some point there'd be some sort of a pandemic, a flu-like pandemic that would be devastating, like this one is. The devastation, to a large extent, is a result not of the flu itself, but of the measures we've taken to sort of mitigate the health damages from the flu, and that leads to various sort of policy questions. Like, we're going to be looking at things like, did we have enough ventilators? Did we have enough personal protective equipment? What about the national stockpile? Things like that. So all those things are going to be discussed. In my work on focusing events, I usually think of how it affects like one sort of policy area, like policies around natural hazard relief or hurricanes or earthquakes. But this touches on so many different things that the policy implications are going to spin out in all kinds of directions for several years after this event.
Thank you. As a scholar, your books, particularly your books, After Disaster, Agenda Setting, Public Policy, and Focusing Events, and your second book, Lessons of Disaster, Policy Change After Catastrophic Events, focus on post-disaster periods. And we are currently in the disaster stage. What advice, if any, would you give to government officials in terms of current responses? And in your judgment, how well is the policymaking process working for during disaster periods currently at state, local, and at national levels?
Well, from what we've seen so far, sort of the broad sort of policy framework that sort of shapes the way we respond to this, with the federal government supporting the states, isn't working as well as we'd hoped. The federal stockpile apparently wasn't providing states with the equipment and the things it needed. I'm still not sure whether all the stories we've heard are fully true in terms of is it as bad as it seems, but it seemed to not be working particularly well. So that sort of framework, if you will, didn't work. I'm working with some colleagues on some research questions around whether or not the current administration's failure to staff certain positions, for example, or decisions to cut budgets, to remove some of the CDC people from China, for example, that did disease surveillance, whether that had an impact sort of in shaping the conditions under which decisions are made. But what you're asking about now, in the here and now, what advice would I give to government officials? And my sense is that by and large, most states are doing about as well as I think we can expect, or better. Washington State really got on top of it, for example, and that was the first case in the country, I think it was in Washington State, and we really were worried about that being a real hotspot, but it sort of, they tamped down on that. New York, it got kind of out of control, but the curve is starting to bend downward, I think, in New York State, and at least leveling off. In most states, I think we've been successful at flattening the curve, in the current parlance. The governors are in a lot of these states have resisted some of the loud calls to open things up prematurely, liberate whatever state. The public opinion polling data suggests that they're on the right track, that the public doesn't want a premature opening of things. They would really rather not see another spike or a spike in coronavirus cases. They'd like a measured response to this, small steps, and the things that everybody are calling for, things like, antibody testing, more testing to see if people have the virus, isolation of people who have it, contact tracing, PPEs, masks, stuff like that, all seem to make sense. So I think that we're doing about as well as we can under the circumstances. Could we have done better? Certainly, but that's a question for analyzing on another day.
I do have a follow-up question on this
Sure.
for you, if that's all right.
Sure.
As far as thinking about the differences in terms of policy responses from a Washington, for example, to another state, Washington State to another state, from a process standpoint, are there things going on in the states that are doing a better job as far as responding versus states that have been laggards as far as responding that you are noticing?
I'm not 100% sure, although some people are attributing it to ideological differences. I mean, that, Democratic states are more likely to be more stringent than Republican states, but I'm not sure that really holds. I mean, if you look at Maryland, for example, or I think, I can't remember if Ohio's a Republican or not. I think it is. I'd have to go back and check. But there's some reason to believe that there may be ideological differences. There may be regional differences. I mean, Wyoming just doesn't have that many cases. The last state to get a case was West Virginia. They didn't have a huge caseload. What you're kind of asking is kind of one of the things we're asking internationally. For example, Sweden was much less stringent about sort of, closing restaurants and, public places than, say, Norway and Denmark. And their death rate is quite a bit higher from COVID than Norway or Denmark. And so one of the things I'd want to look at the state level is see, whether there's state-by-state variation. I think that there's room for state-by-state variation because I don't think every state is experiencing COVID the same way. So I think there is room for some states to deal with this differently than other states. I think it's a little too soon to know who's doing it well or who's doing it best. I can take a guess. And time will tell. I mean, one of the things we're concerned about is Georgia opening up too soon, for example. Well, we'll look at the data and see if that's the case or not. But we've got we've got some time. We're going to need to take the time to find out, who's doing this better and who's not.
Sure. Thank you. So in terms of one of your research interests is how people talk about these events and how people tell stories of natural disasters in the policy process. What narratives do you think are going to take hold after the coronavirus pandemic we moved on from it, that you expect will influence public policy in the coming years?
There are several potential narratives that will spin out over the next several years. One potential narrative is that the current administration, the Trump administration, wasn't prepared for it and didn't handle it well. And there are stories coming out in the news about how the president is disengaged to a large extent from the day-to-day sort of management of this issue, shows up at the briefings and says a lot of stuff that doesn't really make sense in the context of what other people are doing at the federal government to work on it. People like, Dr. Fauci and the Surgeon General and folks like that. So that's one narrative. An attempted narrative is to call it the China virus or the Chinese virus. I don't think that's really got legs anymore. I think, in fact, since a lot of the, we know that some of the cases came from people traveling in from Europe. There's going to be counter narratives about how this isn't really that big a deal, that we overreacted to it, that it wasn't, the cure is worse than the disease, that we shut our economy down in fundamental ways. And I wonder if there's going to be some sort of post-pandemic narratives about resilience and about how we came together to defeat this thing. That would be a sort of a positive narrative. The disaster literature talks a lot about pro-social behavior, about people being pretty resilient, people, doing, when given good information to protect themselves and their communities, will act upon it. So those are some potential narratives. So those are things I've been thinking about, but it's going to take a long time. The nature of my work is such that we really don't know a lot of these things until about 3 to 5 years after they've happened, because I tend to look at the long span, which in some ways is a little frustrating for someone like me, because I really want to dig in and understand this right now, but I have to wait for it to play out in legislation and other actions at both the state and the federal level.
Sure. And I totally understand, as far as waiting for some time, maybe it's 10 years, maybe a decade, to get a sense of really what took hold. But let me press you on this with a follow-up.
Sure.
Do you think, for example, perhaps there will be a greater importance to science-based decision-making moving forward?
I think that's possible. I think that in this coming presidential election, I think that might be an issue. I think that one of the differentiators between, say, Joe Biden and Donald Trump, I think if the Biden campaign is going to say science was important to our response in coronavirus, science is important to our response to a lot of things, public health, global, climate change, things like that, and we should not denigrate science.
Mm-hmm.
That I mean, it's difficult to make sort of appeals to the founding fathers in a period in which I think most people don't have a deep sense of the history of the founding of the republic. But the founders of the republic, were very much in sort of that age of reason, enlightenment, Thomas Jefferson and folks like that. And you can almost appeal to that sort of strain in American politics, although there's always long been an anti-intellectual and anti-scientific strain, and it's not new. But yes, I think that there's going to be, well, let's put it this way. When people are asked, who do you trust? Anthony Fauci scores a lot higher than the president of the United States. Governors score higher than the president. And most governors are saying we're going to be guided by the science. So most people, most of the time, I think, believe scientific expertise. I think where we're seeing pushback against that are from vocal, loud minorities who get a lot of attention in the news media because what they're doing is novel, but they don't represent a majority opinion. But they represent a large enough strain of thought that it could be contentious. It could get in the way. But back to your question, will science be taken, say, more seriously about these sort of matters? I think so. I think when a vaccine is available, for example, most people are going to get it. There'll still be some anti-vaccine people, but most people want the vaccine and will line up willingly to get it, much like we did for polio vaccines in the 50s and 60s.
Thank you, Dr. Birkland. Prior to your career in academia, you had also served in state government in New Jersey, serving both in the governor's office there and also subsequently in that state's Department of Transportation. I know that we've talked about states here already in our conversation. What challenges, opportunities in public policymaking do you see states having to grapple with as this crisis passes on? I was looking at a chart from Utah last night, and they're talking about sort of stabilizing their economy and getting things moving by fall of this year.
Yeah.
What's your sense broadly about the states post-crisis?
Well, like I said before, I think there's going to be some state-by-state variation. I think the opportunities are that states, can learn from each other. We talk a lot about learning in the public policy process. How do states learn from what other states are doing or other countries are even doing? And so there's going to be, the old saying about federalism is that you got 50 states that are laboratories of democracy, right? That every state does things a little bit differently, and there are some that are leaders and there's some that are followers in the sense that they wait for other people to move. But I think we're going to learn from each other. And what's interesting is the states have kind of banded together. So you have similar states like Washington, Oregon, and California have come together as a group. the Midwest states, Ohio, Michigan, states like that have come together. I heard that my state might coordinate to some extent with Virginia over its actions. Some of the states that are further south, South Carolina and Georgia, are looking like they're going to sort of open the valve a little more quickly. People are worried about that. But there's opportunities for states to sort of craft a solution that makes the most sense for them, right? We have to keep in mind, though, that even within states, there's considerable variation within states. Like my county, Wake County, is the second biggest county in the state. We're in the second biggest metropolitan area in the state after the Charlotte area, and we're going to probably have local differences that are different than say some of the more rural parts of our state. But there's lots of opportunities for the states to to take the actions that they think are most appropriate. The challenges are with resources. Do they need the resources to ensure that their hospital capacity is where it needs to be? Because I don't think we're going to get to a point where we're fully free of COVID. I would like to think so. Maybe we will be, but the goal here is to make it manageable. Contact tracing, antibody testing, all those tests, so that you can isolate people, quarantine the ones that are sick, prevent community transmission to the greatest extent possible. Those are the challenges, and that's going to take time, resources, expertise, and that's going to vary state by state, and we're going to have to see how that plays out.
Thank you, Dr. Birkland. I do have a follow-up on that question as well. I guess maybe to talk about post-COVID moment, you're right, it's probably not too reasonable. Maybe at some point when it's mitigated enough, what's your sense as far as opportunities for political entrepreneurs in different states? States, I understand, there's a lot of monies that's not going to be available any longer. Tax funds have gone down. Folks are filing unemployment. Will political entrepreneurs in some states use the crisis as an opportunity to craft proposals to bring down the social welfare state or maybe build it up? What kinds of changes in policymaking might one expect?
Well, I think you'll see both. I think you'll see efforts in both directions. I think on the one hand, after this settles down, people are going to look at how much we spent, and there's going to be a move to say, oh, geez, we're overspending. We've got to control, domestic spending. Of course, domestic spending has stimulative effects in the economy, which is why we're doing all this stuff right now. But I think there's also a sense that the 40-year project that began with the Reagan administration of dismantling or attempting to dismantle key parts of the welfare state really didn't work. We have greater income inequality than we've had since the 1920s. We've got an argument that people at the top of the economic ladder, if you will, are undertaxed, and they benefit just as much as anyone else from these efforts to stabilize the economy or to promote public health. To spend money to promote public health. So there may be a counter mobilization, if you will, against the sort of the dismantling of the welfare state. You think about the New Deal. The New Deal was like in the 1930s, and by the late 1970s, there'd been attacks on the New Deal all along, but the late 1970s, there was a big deregulatory movement, under Jimmy Carter, and then Ronald Reagan, was really, anti-big government, right? And so we've had about 40 years of that kind of thing. And this may be the event that tips us into a new sort of conceptualization of what the modern welfare state in the United States should look like. Or it could lead to, it probably will lead to, a counter argument that we need to be more fiscally prudent, whatever that looks like. But it's too early to really tell right now, because everything is just in reactive mode. And right now, Congress seems to be perfectly happy to pass relief bills and then worry about what to do about that down the road.
Sure. In addition to your role as a professor or scholar of public policy, you also serve in an administrative role as Associate Dean for Research and Engagement at North Carolina State University. And I wonder if you would share with our viewers a little bit of your responsibilities in this role currently, and also say a little bit about how universities are going to have to adjust with the coming budget shortfalls and other challenges in the coming months and years.
Right, and my role is I'm the assistant dean, like you said, for research engagement in the College of Humanities and Social Sciences in my university, one of 10 colleges, I think it's 10, at North Carolina State University. So there are several other colleges where I have counterparts there. And some of the challenges we're facing from my role is to promote research and scholarship in the social sciences and in the humanities. And our office processes grant applications and things like that. And, we're a research university. We have, several dozen doctoral programs. We have 5 doctoral programs in my college. We have, faculty doing research and publishing all the time. And so, you know, and my counterparts in the other colleges have real challenges right now because people can't get into their laboratories. And in fact, we have a process now for, who can get into what lab, especially if you're doing research related to COVID. We've got people making protective equipment. We've got people making non-woven fabrics to go into face masks. We've got all kinds of things going on. So the challenge is, like you said, we're concerned about how many students we'll have next fall. We're concerned about whether or not we'll be able to have courses on campus next fall. We're, of course, holding our courses for summer online. So far, our summer enrollments are holding up pretty well. Students seem to want to have courses this summer. And one wonders even whether it's more convenient in a way for some students who might be at home to just take summer courses, from home, wherever they are in North Carolina. Most of our students are from North Carolina. But certainly state tax revenues are going to be at risk, and things that are going to happen at a lot of universities are going to include, among other things, no new faculty hiring, no travel for faculty to conferences. And that's important. Faculty go to professional conferences to present their research and learn from each other, but that'll be cut back. Non-essential personnel won't be rehired. Some universities will probably let people go if they have to. We don't quite know yet what's going to happen at our university. We had a note from our chancellor yesterday saying that it is our plan to have students on campus this fall, but we're not naive to what's going on. So every day people are running scenarios trying to figure out what it might look like. It might be a hybrid situation in which we have courses in shifts. You've got a 60-person class, let's say, that meets 3 times a week, and it might meet online twice a week and in person once a week with only 20 students at a time, things like that. I have a colleague whose university is thinking of moving to trimesters from semesters and, spreading out students like that. There's all kinds of things that are likely to change in the near term. But universities have confronted these kind of things before, and I think it's going to be painful. There's no way around it, but we'll get through it because people need universities. People want universities to be there, and we're still waiting to see what happens. I keep reminding myself that we've only been working from home now about 5 or 6 weeks. So it's still early days. And so we're still waiting to see what happens.
Thank you. And finally, our last question for you. Many of our students here at MSU Denver consider law school, perhaps grad school, or other kinds of postgraduate opportunities. And for a student thinking about grad school, particularly in public policy or related discipline like public administration, political science, what sorts of advice might you have?
Well, I think it's great. I went to graduate school, of course, and thoroughly enjoyed it. I got my master's degree at Rutgers University and then stayed another 5 years in New Jersey working in state government there. And I'm glad I had that experience before I went on for my PhD. I think it's for people who want to be in public service, some sort of graduate education is usually required. A lot of jobs require an MPA, for example, or an MPP, Master's in Public Policy. For students who are interested in a PhD, the social sciences, people hear about how tough it is to get academic jobs and it's going to be a tough academic job market for a few years. But an undergraduate now, maybe thinking about going to graduate school in the fall of 2020, or maybe deferring it to 2021. By the time they graduate, we'll be 4, 5 years, 6 years out of this situation, and maybe back on our feet again. There's still opportunities, and there's opportunities even if you go on for graduate school, even for a PhD that don't necessarily involve being in academia, like being an analyst or working at an NGO or a nonprofit or a think tank and things like that. State government even, there are a lot of people with doctorates there. Not everybody has to get a doctorate, but if you're interested, there's excellent programs all over the country. One of the best programs is just up the street from you guys at, or probably next door, at CU Denver. I have lots of colleagues there, and they have one of the strongest policy process programs. That's my field's public policy process, not policy analysis, which is a little different. But there are other strong programs all over the country, and right in Colorado. So I always think that graduate education is a good thing. I think it helps you burnish your resume, if you will, and it teaches skills that you may not have had a chance to pick up as an undergraduate, analytic skills, writing skills, that are in demand by employers. So I think it's great to go to graduate school, and when speaking for myself, it worked out really well. But my advice is to explore all the options, see what's out there, talk to your professors, talk to professors at other institutions, ask your professors if they know people at institutions that you might want to attend. That's how this usually works, is by building a network and learning of what the opportunities are. And but I'm certain that students that are interested in this can do very well.
Thank you, Dr. Birkland, and thanks so much for joining us this morning. We're in the midst of this COVID crisis, and I know that in your role as administrator, scholar, professor at Raleigh, you're likely very, very busy. So we really appreciate you joining us.
Well, I'm glad to do it. I'm really happy, and of course, if your students would like to discuss any of these things with me further, they're free to reach out to me at any time.
Great. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.